Hi everyone, and welcome to Southasiasphere, Himal South Asian's monthly roundup of news events and developing stories across South Asia. I'm Raisa, and I'm joined by my colleagues Shubhanga, Marlan, and Shweta. Hi guys!
Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
So, our big stories in this edition are significant developments in Myanmar and the history of enforced disappearances and transitional justice across the region. In Around Southasia in 5 minutes, we're talking about Democracy Day in Tibet, Bangladesh's ban on PubG and other games, the fate of the Millennium Challenge Corporation in Nepal, and the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. Let's begin with the situation in Myanmar.
Thanks, Raisa. So, there have been some new developments in Myanmar which could significantly impact its political direction in the coming days. But I wanted to begin by noting that August 25th marked the 4th year of the beginning of the genocidal attacks on Myanmar's Rohingya people by the army. Now, what was interesting about this date this time around was also the way in which the government in exile, it's formally called the National Unity Government, but also the military regime, how they responded to this date. So the NUG came out with a statement saying that they were deeply saddened by the horrendous violence, the human rights violations, all the displacement that Rohingya people suffered 4 years ago. And they also repeated their more recent commitment to abolishing the discriminatory citizenship laws. But the statement avoided using the word genocide, which is, not unexpected since part of its current leadership was in charge of the government when the violence occurred. But the military regime's response to the same date was also remarkable, isn't it?
Yes, it was quite ironic, especially given that on the 24th of August, the military regime filed this legal amendment to criminalize genocide in Myanmar's domestic law and define it by the recognized international standard. But they haven't stated the reason behind the amendment, but experts say that this could be an attempt by the military to ease international pressure for genocide charges and atrocities against the Rohingya, and also to undermine international legal mechanisms, as the military can now try and argue that genocide can be investigated and prosecuted domestically and international action is therefore not needed. Now, with the UN expected to decide whether Myanmar is represented in the General Assembly by the military regime or the National Unity Government, two key questions that remain are who will represent Myanmar at the ICJ and what the implications of this decision will be for a genocide case before the ICJ.
Yeah, and just related to this, I recently read a story about the Human Rights Ministry of this government in exile, which has started collecting information on the military government's killings and what the NUG terms war crimes since the February coup. And so they aim to submit a report to the UN Human Rights Council later this month. So it's likely we'll hear more on this subject in the coming days.
Yeah, Shubhanga, and I think all these kind of developments also need to be kind of put in context of the political contestation in Myanmar today, especially the escalation of political violence. So something that's worth pointing out is that the armed wing of the NUG, which is the People's Defense Forces, has been resisting the military government through kind of sporadic attacks across the country. But just last week, the NUG actually formally declared war against the military government to root out military rule. So it appears that we're going to see more unrest and even more deaths in the coming days. Although, it's not clear if the PDF actually does have the capacity to conduct a countrywide war. So it's not clear what the implication of that statement is. But that's been interesting to kind of follow.
So, moving on to our next big story on transitional justice in South Asia. Now, August 30th marked the International Day to protect victims of enforced disappearances. It was marked across the South Asian region by protests, research, and stories highlighting this ongoing crisis of enforced disappearances.
Yeah, did any of you guys see the event that was hosted by the Office on Missing Persons?
Ah, yeah.
Not me.
Yeah, so this was one of the kind of first engagements that the OMP had with the public since the presidential elections, when the 20th Amendment allowed the president more input into the appointment of independent commissions, and critics kind of say that this has undermined their independence. What was interesting was that it was kind of markedly different to earlier events in the previous regime, where there was at least some attempt to kind of center the stories of families of the disappeared. The OMP didn't really talk about their plans for the future. They also didn't allow anyone apart from the panelists to speak or ask questions, so people were just kind of posting questions in the chat box.
There were some protests, though, I heard.
Yes, so the family members of the disappeared did mark the day with protests at home in Mullaitivu and in other areas. They lit candles and they held placards calling for justice. There were also several Zoom events which were attended by families of the disappeared, which were held in Sinhala and Tamil. Considering that the country is currently under lockdown because of COVID-19 and an increase in cases, the families had to adapt their way of protesting. But Sri Lanka's actually had a long history of enforced disappearances, which dates back to the JVP insurrections in the 1970s. And there have been multiple commissions which have been established to investigate disappearances over the years. The first of which I think was set up in the 90s by President R. Premadasa at the time. But these commissions didn't really lead to anything concrete for families. So family members have expressed disenchantment with government commissions. I've personally heard many of them kind of saying that they've had to repeat the same very traumatic story for them before commission after commission, and they've had no redress and no answers. So while the OMP was finally established in 2016, these processes kind of came to a standstill during Sri Lanka's constitutional crisis in 2018. And I guess this recent OMP event wouldn't really have inspired confidence among families waiting for answers in Sri Lanka.
So, over in Bangladesh, Human Rights Watch published Where No Son Can Enter, a decade of enforced disappearances in Bangladesh last month. Now, this 57-page report, based on over 115 interviews, it urges the UN to carry out an independent international investigation into enforced disappearances in Bangladesh and call for donors and trade partners to hold senior members of the country's security forces accountable. It reports that nearly 600 people have been forcibly disappeared since Prime Minister Hasina took office. Now, this is according to Bangladeshi human rights groups. The majority of these were either released or formally produced in court as arrests, and some were even found dead. Human Rights Watch has verified 86 enforced disappearances cases in the last 10 years, in which the victims' whereabouts remain unknown to this day.
And in past episodes of Southasiasphere, we have spoken about the controversial Digital Security Act, which gives arbitrary powers to law enforcement agencies to carry out invasive forms of surveillance, intimidate, and imprison journalists, social media users, and even children under 18 for criticizing the ruling party.
Yeah, right. And I think importantly, the report also talks about the politicized nature of some of these incidents.
Yeah.
Including cases of opposition members and activists being killed in what is euphemistically called crossfire incidents or gunfights. And usually such incidents also escalate just before the elections.
Yeah, exactly, Shubham. Now, the responses from the government to numerous reports in the past have been either denial or mockery or both. Now, for example, Sajid Mohammed Wazid, the son of Sheikh Hasina, and government advisor on information and communication technology, in 2018 stated, and I quote, many of the disappeared are leaders of the opposition who are accusing the government of kidnapping them while they are, in fact, trying to avoid arrest by disappearing. Some of the disappearances are almost comical. Now, the thing is, this this is not hearsay. These enforced disappearances have been all well documented by the UN, civil society groups, journalists, the Bangladesh National Human Rights Commission, and of course, victims and their families. And it's no surprise that many of these victims were critics of the ruling Awami League government, now which reveals the extremely politicized nature of these incidents.
And the situation in Nepal on this front is also quite disappointing. Two national bodies have actually been formed since 2014-15, I think, as part of the transitional justice process, to basically investigate the abuses that took place during the conflict between the Maoist rebels and the state. One of them is called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The other is a body for investigating enforced disappearances. And the latter one has actually published a list of 2,500 individuals who were allegedly forcibly disappeared. But the key thing to know about, on this matter in Nepal is that successive governments, and which basically means all major political parties, have tried their best to water down the laws that are supposed to apply to the guilty parties. And the Supreme Court has managed to strike down all such attempts so far. But at this point, it's difficult to actually even see, investigations begin on this case, not to mention the eventual litigation.
In December 2020, the Maldivian government ratified the Transitional Justice Act and established the Office of the Ombudsman for Transitional Justice to initiate long overdue redress mechanisms for survivors of past abuses. However, despite multiple pledges for an independent and open investigation and prosecution of perpetrators of enforced disappearances, such as journalist Ahmad Rilwan, his family still awaits justice. Recently, Rilwan's family raised concern over the fact that the Commission on Deaths and Disappearances, after 3 years since its inception, has not yet forwarded a single case out of the 27 incidents that the Commission is investigating for prosecution. The Commission also said that the investigation of Maldives blogger Yamin Rashid's murder is delayed due to an ongoing trial in connection to the case. To find out more, also check out our articles on the Maldives Transitional Justice Act by Mushfiq Mohammed and Yamin Rashid's sister Aisha Rashid's account of the family's struggle for justice. Moving on to our next segment, Around Southasia in 5 minutes.
Thanks, Shweta. So, moving to Tibet, Tibet actually marked its 61st Democracy Day on September 2nd, which actually marks the anniversary of the first elected representative body, the Tibetan Parliament, in 1960. And this is marked by the exiled Tibetan community. Now, an official ceremony was held, which was organized by the Central Tibet Administration, with speeches being made on the evolution of Tibetan democracy and dance performances. But in contrast, just weeks before, on 19th of August, China marked the 70th anniversary of what they termed the peaceful liberation of the Tibet Autonomous Region, and they renewed calls to accept the rule of the Communist Party. So it's been really interesting to see the different reporting and wording used during these two official days, with China continuing to use terms like peaceful liberation to mark their occupation of Tibet, and the exiled Tibetan community choosing to commemorate the anniversary of electing their first parliament in exile instead.
Bad news for PubG and Free Fire players in Bangladesh, because the High Court has directed the government to put a stop to all kinds of destructive online games for 3 months to, and I quote, save children and adolescents from moral and social degradation. This ruling was precipitated by a petition by 2 Supreme Court lawyers that requested the High Court to order government authorities to identify those who are involved in money laundering using apps and online games.
On 7th of September, the Taliban announced an all-male interim government drawn almost entirely from Taliban ranks, and those who had positions in the 1990s Taliban, including an interior minister under UN sanction and wanted by the FBI for his ties with Al-Qaeda. This list did not include any women, despite promises of an inclusive cabinet. It's also worth noting that the Taliban has excluded a Ministry of Women's Affairs and brought back the Ministry for Promotion of Virtue and Prevention of Vice. The Taliban have also announced that Afghan women will be required to wear conservative Islamic clothing and that university classrooms must be separated by gender. In response to recent protests led by Afghan women, the Taliban orchestrated a march of completely veiled women who filled an auditorium at Kabul University's Education Center. To find out more on this, read our latest interview with Mary Akrami, Executive Director of the Afghan Women Network, on how Afghan women activists have a difficult future under the Taliban administration.
So, in Nepal, the media and public sphere is right now saturated with news about the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a US foreign aid agency. Nepal signed a deal for a $500 million grant back in 2017, basically for constructing electricity transmission lines and upgrading a highway. Back when it made very little news and there was no controversy, but over the past 2 years there has been growing opposition to it in some quarters. And it's become a huge public controversy, rife with misinformation, and it remains to be ratified in the parliament. My own observation has been that this has very little to do with any debate on the economics of foreign aid, which actually would be quite valuable, but more to do with the kind of narratives about increasing global power competition in the region, and maybe more interestingly, how that gets deployed in domestic political scenario for domestic consumption and by different actors, sometimes in unpredictable ways. And those who followed the fate of the MCC in Sri Lanka might also draw interesting observations to what's happening in Nepal. And now we'll be moving on to our culture section, Bookmarked.
Thanks, Shubhanga. So, this month I wanted to actually talk about a podcast series called Witnesses to History. It's been put together by this digital platform, historicaldialogue.lk. And it kind of features interviews with oral historians, architects, and foodies in Sri Lanka. And if you want to know a little bit more about Sri Lanka, particularly different kind of historical aspects that don't always make it to what's very easily publicly available, it's worth a listen. I particularly enjoyed the last episode, which centers around food, but not just because it's a topic that I find interesting, but I also like the way that particular episode kind of wove in these anecdotes which have contemporary relevance. So in this episode, one of the people being interviewed talks about her memories of rationing and import controls in the 1970s, which does have contemporary relevance with today's food emergency. And there's this kind of discussion of domestic workers in passing as well, which has also been a topic of discussion in Sri Lanka after the death of a young domestic worker. And of course, there's also discussion of Sri Lanka's history of conflict, including the 1983 riots. So if you're kind of interested in just listening to different kind of aspects of history, from different oral history projects to, the history of some of our iconic buildings and like the history of our food, I would recommend checking that podcast out.
Yeah, so I've also been hearing nothing but good things about the podcast, and I haven't really gotten around to listening to all of them. But I did join one of the earlier webinars on conflict and memory in Sri Lankan English writing on the 1980s. Now, early Sri Lankan writers in English were, mostly critiqued for either being, too elitist or focusing on a utopian village. So when 1983 happened, and of course then the war, it acted like an impetus for writers. So much so that there had to be some mention of it in their poetry or writing. or they would be accused of contributing to historical erasure. Now, for example, Ondaatje has been accused of trivializing the JUP insurrection, the first one in 1971. And so I was really interested in this webinar, in an academic sense too, because we often have like post-90s writers who write about the 80s, especially about the 1983 Black July, and of course the 87 89 insurrection. And you could say that they were quite removed from it, in terms of time. And I mean, there's not a lot of writers except for Jean Ansarayakam and Richard G. Soisa, who responded to what was happening in the country like immediately. So there is a sense of immediacy to their writing, rather than the post-90s writers like Shyam Selvadure, Ayature Santhan, Amlavana Sivanathan, and others who reflect on the 80s. So I really found the discussion, the webinar, like really interesting, and I'm hoping to move on to the podcast as well.
Interesting. Actually, what you said, Marlon, reminded me of a piece that I worked on, in the sense that this kind of erasure of the violence of the insurrections, it was also carried over into the press. So
Right.
when I was doing a piece that was kind of marking like so many years since the 83 riots, we went to the archives and we were going through like all the press coverage, and it was so interesting, the different language that was used
Right.
to kind of describe people who were being arrested or who were killed because they were suspected of being involved in the JVP riots, or they were being
Right.
rounded up for questioning, and those who were of Tamil ethnicity and who were suspected of being part of the LTT.
Right.
The newspapers would very freely use the word terrorist for Tamils, but it was I forget the exact word they used, but it was something like revolutionaries, like a much softer kind of word, and that was really interesting, and that kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, of course, I can't remember as far back as the late 80s, but I mean, when you look, for stories, for especially like news pieces, there seems to be like a fog over it. Of course, we know what happened, but there's so much that's been kind of that's been like erased from the public domain. So it's even if you want to like look back, I mean, thankfully we have people who lived during that time, and like you, for example, even our parents who went through that time, who kind of it's a lived experience for them, so we actually can find information about it. But I mean, there's always, I mean in my opinion, there's always seemed to be like a fog over, especially during that last like the 87 89, that time period.
Yeah, that's true. I guess it does live unfortunately, through a lot of like oral histories and memories. Like you said, I mean, that was my first encounter, of hearing of the insurrections was through my parents' memories of it. So that's why this podcast also is kind of interesting, in that it's trying to actually engage with these different projects, and like also has sections on oral histories and things like that. So yeah, definitely recommend checking it out.
So over in India, on August 24th, the Delhi University, despite protests from at least 14 members of the Academic Council, decided to drop Bengali writer and activist Mahasweta Devi's story titled Draupadi, and also works of Tamil Dalit feminist writers Bama and Sukirta Rani from the BA Honours English syllabus, as it allegedly shows the Indian Army in a bad light, hence anti-national. Now, over 1,000 academics, writers, students have called on the university to reinstate these texts. So my recommendation for the month would be to go back and engage with these texts, which are essential readings for students now more than ever to understand systemic oppressions of the Dalit and Adivasi communities, especially in gendered terms.
Have you guys been watching anything these days? I've actually finished The Chair.
Oh yeah, I watched that as well.
Yeah, same here.
What did you guys think of it?
I mean, I thought that it was funny. Like, there were parts that were quite funny, but I also came away, like, I personally really like Sandra Oh. She's hilarious. So I kind of enjoyed watching her perform again. But having said that, I had kind of mixed feelings about the series, and especially the way that they portrayed students. They kind of had this very simplistic portrayal of students as being very reactionary and not really thinking critically and engaging with issues, and being so like focused on social media in a way that felt like a caricature. So I wasn't a big fan of that aspect of it.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting word, caricature. I kind of felt that all throughout, that these were caricatures of like, you know, different elements in academia that we tend to see from the outside, like so the stereotypes. I mean, of course, stereotypes. You know, some of them, some of the you know, characters, they do reflect what's going on. I mean, what's happening in the academia too. But it seemed, like you said, very quite a kind of a reductive engagement. But yeah, like, I mean, it's a nice, funny. I mean, if you don't think so much about what's going on, you can just, you know, it's very short. It's like 6 episodes, I think. So you can just get through it, you know, without really thinking about, like, going into it like really in depth.
I was also kind of thinking, you know, in terms of what kind of cinema and TV shows that are being made or were made in South Asia about universities and higher education, and kind of was thinking about the update that Shweta was giving on certain kind of readings being removed from university syllabus, and, you know, and to think if there have been kind of cinematic ways of capturing that, you know, in films or TV shows. And I mean, I'm trying to think of South Asian cinema that have dealt interestingly with higher education and excluding things like Three Idiots or, you know, that kind of Bollywood version of caricatures of university. Can you guys think of something? Do you remember?
In terms of, like, I think in Sri Lanka we have something called the university novel. So not really, you know, on the, like, the visual medium, but there are lots of novels written about, especially the University of Peradeniya. So, like, and, you know, lots of bad novels. There are some good ones too, but like some terrible novels. You know, these people, they wake up when they're like 60 or 70, and they kind of nostalgically try to recreate, you know, their time at the university. And, you know, when it comes to like Peradeniya, it's a very, like, a beautiful university. So, you know, they talk about the flowers and the garden, the trees and everything. So, and while kind of ignoring everything else that was happening during that time, you know, the politicized nature of university life, you know, class issues, because like most of these writers are from, you know, from the elite class, and they were like English speaking, and so they were quite removed from what was going on during that time.
So my recommendation for this month is this new book by investigative reporter Josy Joseph, titled The Silent Coup, where he essentially argues that the Indian democracy has been subverted by the country's security agencies, who've grown so, you know, highly sophisticated, but also arbitrary and politicized and corrupt in their functioning. And he basically links this to how, you know, institutions like the intelligence agencies, police, army, tax departments, they've all responded to insurgencies and militancies of the 1980s and 90s in such ways that, you know, today these bodies act in ways that frequently violate Indian citizens' legal and constitutional protections, often at the behest of their political masters. So that's my recommendation.
And on that note, that's it for this edition of Southasiasphere. Do head to our website, himalmag.com, to see more of Himal's work. We actually just recently had another episode of South Asian Conversations, our third, which is on borders and borderlands. So if you want to check that out, do head to our website as well. And while you're at it, check out our membership plans and support us. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
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 For more Himal podcasts, go to himalmag.com/podcasts.